Hello and welcome to the 7th edition of the Minor Compositions podcast. Today we're joined with Becky Binns, who is the author of a just released and very excellent book, Gee Vaucher, Beyond Punk, Feminism, and the Avant-Garde. Thanks for joining us today, Becky.
Hi, no problem at all. Good to be here.
Cool. I was really excited to see your book come out. It's a really great book. It's a great read. So maybe as a way to start us off, and this is going to be, hopefully just sort of a nice conversation between friends, and I think both of us would think of ourselves as friends of Gee. One of the things that struck me interesting about Gee and her work is she's in this quite strange position of people around the world sort of know her particular style of intense collage, hyperrealism. You know, her work is very recognizable, but it's very, her as an artist is she's much less known, right? So I wanted to ask you about sort of how did you come to write this book? How did you, how did we get here?
Yeah. Well, I think it was, it was been quite an unexpected thing that has kind of happened in my life, really, because it wasn't through a sort of conventional career route, if you like, that led me through sort of BA, MA, PhD, and then writing a book. So I have gone through all those processes, but at different times and different stages. And really what sort of kick-started my interest in Gee and her work is when I was a lot younger, and I sort of came across her work when I was sort of living in squats and stuff. And it was after the crash, but people that I knew were still listening to the music and still had, the posters, the really sort of striking artwork that she created for their record releases, sort of on the walls and things like that. And it was just sort of very, very powerful, and sort of really struck a chord with me, as well as all, the music. And I guess, it had a profound impression on me. I did various other sort of occupations, and it was only when I sort of went back to do an MA in art history quite a few years later, and there was like a historicisation process going on of punk and protest and things, that have been going on during the 1980s, that I started to really think again about her work and realised that within art history, people hadn't really heard of her or what she was doing, although they were talking about quite a lot of analogous sort of material. Peter Kennard had quite a high profile. Various sort of punk designers like Jamie Reed and Linda Sterling and so on were quite well known. But no one was really sort of talking about Gee Vaucher. And for my MA dissertation, I arranged to meet her, and she was kind of like open to taking part as an interviewee in the MA. And from there, I sort of met other academics who also knew about her work and really appreciated her work, and agreed that something, a proper research project should be done on this. Eventually, I was put on to Russ Vestley and got the funding, so I could actually afford to do the PhD. And from there, rewrote all that research as a book that was, commissioned by the publisher, by MUP. So, it was kind of a sort of series of coincidences, really, that kind of made that happen, I guess. So that's why I sort of referred to that as a sort of unorthodox route in the book. it's quite interesting how it's kind of come about. But, you know, anecdotally, even though her work wasn't sort of acknowledged in the press or in academia or whatever at that point, going back to about 2010 now, it was anecdotally acknowledged among quite a few sort of academics and designers and people that I spoke to. So yeah, it's very overdue, really. I think this, as you'll be aware from having done the retrospective of her work, you know, it's quite overdue, this kind of critical attention being paid to her work and to its significance and so on. Yeah.
I think I had a quite similar introduction to her work, you know, as a teenager, sort of sitting down and listening to Christ album, listening to various Christ albums, and just sitting there and while listening and looking through the artwork, going, this is amazing, and not knowing very much about where it came from, but being very intrigued by it. But that's something very interesting you're talking about. Sort of, maybe you can talk a little more about sort of why you think that she was sort of was passed over for many years by sort of curators or by art historians.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's an interesting one because she's kind of it's obviously going right back to Crass and before that, even with the sort of radical art, you know, performance art collectives and things, Exit and Stamford Rivers Quartet and so on. There's been, you know, a decision that was quite kind of common in among artists in the 1970s who, you know, wanted their work to have some sort of social function rather than just being, you know, part of their career. And then through Crass, there was a more sort of decisive sort of stance about kind of maintaining a sort of independence, if you like, you know, setting up Crass Records. Existential Press obviously was set up earlier than that in the early 70s to produce all their sort of materials and publications themselves. But, you know, there's been a sort of quite strong ethos of not wanting to be kind of known in a sort of commercialized environment. And, you know, as part of Crass, obviously, Gee's work was just part of the output of that collective, and it was anonymous, the individual's contributions. And Gee sort of said for quite a while, people assumed that the artwork was all created by a man, you know, and she only started to sort of come forward and even sort of claim credit for the work that she'd done quite a long time after Crass had, you know, had come to an end. I mean, having said that, obviously she's not kind of unfamiliar with working in commercialized environments. You know, she worked, you know, as you know, as a successful freelance illustrator in New York in the late 70s for a whole series of magazines for, you know, Rolling Stone and New York Times and Ebony and all the rest of it. But, you know, sort of not compromising herself sort of politically or personally has, you know, been very important throughout her life, even as she's had, like, in more recent years, a major retrospective at Colchester at First Sight, and also, you know, she's been exhibiting really quite widely in the last few years. But, you know, I've sort of said in the book towards the end that even now, when there is interest from art galleries and things, she still maintains quite an interesting position compared to how most artists sort of function, really. You know, she's still kind of, she's got nothing in principle against selling her work to public institutions, but when it's actually come down to it, she has had interest from the University of Cambridge for their Kettle's Yard, the head of the Arts Council, and so on, have all shown interest in purchasing her work, but she's quite sort of reluctant, you know, and I think that's all part of, you know, her kind of autonomy in that sense.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting sort of tension there, in the sense that both her work and the work with Crass, that it was based upon this very fierce sense of autonomy and not wanting to compromise at all the conditions on which you worked or how you produced, which is obviously very laudable and to celebrate. But it's interesting how that also, let's say, prevents certain forms of circulation or prevents going in certain places. So maybe it's sort of way those dynamics play with and against each other but I still think it's much better that she chose an approach. Thinking for a second about the exhibition in Colchester, the way that came about was the university where I work at, Essex, about 10 years ago had started to sort of change its marketing to sort of say that it was a university of rule breakers and sort of like, challenging the established order, that kind of stuff, right? That kind of crap marketing. And so a few of us at the university said, okay, well, if this is what the university says it is, why don't we try to give an honorary degree to a person who actually breaks rules? And so we nominated Gee, and much to our surprise, they said yes, and they gave her an honorary PhD. It was quite funny because when the VC originally sent her, message about this, she responded saying, "Are you sure? Is this a mistake? I don't think you meant this." But yeah, so I mean that's always been Gee's thing is that if she has the space and time to do what she wants and how she wants to do it, she'll make amazing stuff. But if she doesn't have that, she's perfectly willing to just walk away, I think.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. Yeah, definitely. And also she's just kind of not, she basically has said that she thinks she's got enough. She's not, making money or making a name for herself hasn't been her sort of motivation in the past. Having said that kind of also runs counter to the fact that certainly other people believe, and she has been, like, for example, she collaborated with me for the book, she with you for the exhibition and so on. She obviously kind of has an interest in her work being seen and known, and and I think it is very overdue for a wider kind of appreciation. Having said that, these kind of things have to be kind of navigated in a way that she's sort of comfortable with, really. And it's the whole kind of meaning that her work has as well. The meaning that it carries is sort of contingent on that, really. So yeah.
One of the things that I really love about the book, as well as getting to work on the exhibition with her, is that while I love the work she did with crafts, that's only, let's say, 7-year period, and her body of work spans over 50 years. It goes across design, film, installation, painting, collage. So it's much broader and much sort of richer, body of work than most people appreciate. So it's one of the nice things of sort of getting to sort of introduce or sort of bring much more discussion and appreciation, sort of wider body of work she's done, which is really great.
Definitely. I think, it's most people still kind of know her work primarily for the work that she did during crafts. And whilst that is, a very intense period of years where she, created an awful lot of very powerful work, very meticulously painted or collaged, material that sort of accompanied the record releases, and she did her international anthems and so on. She's done sort of so much more than that, and it's quite interesting to see how, the work that she's done after, for example, in the 90s, when she had a very kind of freeing up period with her work, and that was really sort of liberating. Instead of doing these sort of quite tight little intense illustrations, she was kind of able to use her body in her work more, to sort of produce larger work, in a whole variety of mediums, and to be more expressive and create installations and sculptures and all sorts of things. And but some of the kind of ideas that are there in crafts are still present in the work that she's done since, but they just kind of, it's a very different kind of vocabulary that she's using, and different kind of means of communicating what she's trying to say. It's not didactic, and I don't mean didactic in a negative sense. I think it's brilliant, the stuff that she did with crafts, but it's moving away from that more direct messaging, if you like, to more kind of subtle and sort of varied forms of communication, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things you said to me before is that there's only so many times you can keep saying that war is crap and the Tories are a bit crap. You know, after you've made the point about 15 times, or 20 other times, you sort of want to move on to doing other things.
Yeah.
And I can see that, you know, work in the 90s, like the animal rights series, where the sort of portraits are much more expressive, much more personal, much more. No, it's not clearly telling you this is bad or not bad. It's much more of an exploration.
No, that's right. And I mean, the fact that, you know, animal rights, which has been, you know, such a preoccupation, you know, sort of throughout her life, whereas, you know, with class there'd be some very sort of direct messaging about that, but, you know, with her works like her paintings, Cow and Bull, and the fact that you can't see the animal's eyes. And I think you said in connection with the exhibition that it means that we're sort of denied a connection, and that's kind of symptomatic of how she feels that humans sort of treat animals, you know. And, you know, with her animal rights series with the photographs, it's this kind of tendency that humans have to sort of project their own kind of, you know, their own sort of, they mold animals in the shape of themselves, if you like. So they have the animals as their, you know, their little friend, their little plaything, their little, I don't know, maybe they want to hunt the animal, but basically it's, they're not actually seeing the animal for what the animal is in themselves. And that's just a very human tendency to sort of dominate animals, dominate nature, humans dominating each other and all the rest of it. And that sort of ties in with her philosophy, really, that you can see, you know, throughout her life.
And I think you could probably say you see that in different ways. So not just the domination of animals, but sort of there's various works where she's looking at sort of patterns of domination or control in the family as a sort of big sort of theme. Yeah, well, certainly the family, you know, and in things like Stations of the Crafts, for example, where you really see the kind of family trap, you know, all the inherent sort of tensions being sort of played out. And, you know, people often see her work as feminist, and she does sort of critique the exploitation and oppression of women, but she's also looking at how men are oppressed by the roles that were kind of expected of them traditionally. And, you know, most of all, children growing up in these kind of unhappy situations where they're sort of controlled and inhibited. So yeah, they're kind of themes that sort of re-emerge in different ways throughout her life as well. Yeah, I've always been slightly puzzled by her sort of rejection of being called a feminist, but the way I've taken it is she's tended to work in sort of mixed gender groups her entire life. And my understanding of 60s, 70s feminism is that was a point where there was a lot of sort of feminist separatism. So I was thinking it to be sort of a rejection of feminism as a separatist thing, but maybe I'm just reading too much into it.
Yeah, I mean, she said, I've never felt separate from the other side of the race. And I guess it's part of her whole sort of rejection of isms, you know, not wanting to be classified in a way that other people might want to classify you, you know. And it's she can be kind of highly attuned to oppression and exploitation of women while not kind of identifying with the sisterhood that was there in the 70s. She's also, you know, she wasn't involved with the women's movement, but she's kind of really carved her own path, and she's not kind of conformed to the social expectations for women of her generation when she was growing up. But again, that kind of seems to be all more part of her sort of autonomy rather than, you know, she goes right back to when she was a child, you know, basically being very headstrong and wanting to carve her own path rather than it being specifically tied up with her identification as being female, as an adult, if you like, and feminist. But it is interesting because, you know, she has used the pin-up quite a lot from, you know, when she did Pent Up in 1975 through International Anthem and Crass, and about sort of misrepresentation of female sexuality in men's magazines and you know, it seems to me as also a comment on how pin-ups were presented in the underground press quite often as you know, meant seemingly kind of about sexual liberation, but actually you know, very much in a there for sort of titillation for like a male readership, really. And yeah, you know, her pin-ups, I think, really sort of contrast with that. The female characters are not submissive in them. They're very much have kind of agency, I guess. And she presents sort of female sexuality through pin-ups very differently to how they're presented by, I don't know, pop artists as well, who just sort of reuse the pin-up in a way that isn't very critical, and right through to post-punk artists as well, who sort of do that, who recycle the pin-up, but without a kind of critique of the role of how female sexuality is presented, if you like. It's just there as a kind of motif. But she's very sort of attuned to that.
This might be a strange thing to say, but one of the unfortunate things about when something is called feminist art, or where you have black art, is that kind of label can almost sort of pigeonhole or restrict how we appreciate a piece of work, but it's only compared to this particular subset of work rather than everything else. And so in a weird way, if for years people were looking at some of Gee's work and assuming it was made by a man, that might almost be weirdly a positive thing, in that they weren't sort of just pigeonholing it, they're just looking at it for what it was, rather than saying, oh, okay, this goes in this little box, but not over here.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And I think because she is commenting on things like restricted roles for women in the family, restricted roles for women as through sexual objectification and so on, that's very much seen as feminist. And you know, you can quite easily have a feminist interpretation of what she's saying there, of her comment there. I mean, I think that I do in some of my commentary on Gee, but that isn't necessarily how she is, her intentions with the work, if you like, you know. And when she says she's never felt separate from the other side of the race, you know, she's very much about kind of looking at constrictive roles for everyone, if you like, in, you know, in the kind of society that we're living in. Not that that isn't also something that feminists also were doing, though, you know. Even in the women's movement in the 1970s, quite often feminists were critiquing how restrictive these kind of gender roles were for men too. So yeah,
I'm usually very hesitant to ever say anything positive about Ayn Rand, but she has this one line that I remember liking, which is something to the effect of a leash is a noose with two ends, with the idea being that anytime there's a sort of relationship of power and control, it's actually sort of causing damage and constriction to the person exercising control, as well as the person being controlled. Yeah. So you have this idea that sort of, you know, gender roles are messing up men as much as they are, well, maybe not as much, but are constricting men's possible experiences of life as much as that they're diminishing women's possible experiences of life.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, you can come at that kind of idea from different places, I guess. You know, I mean, maybe that would mean something different for that person, the way that they're interpreting it, but certainly the idea is also something, I guess, that touches upon how Gee's work has been used as well. Yeah.
Cool. Another thing I think your book does is really interesting, and which is a bit strange to sort of bring up because of just going back to the thought of Gee rejecting any isms. But I think it's really important to appreciate her work, let's say, as situated in relationship to a whole series of art movements, whether how she relates to surrealism or works with Fluxus or has a connection to situationism or 60s counterculture. So there's all these different sort of currents of art and politics that she sort of touches on at times without necessarily being fully part of.
Yeah. I mean, I went to see the Carolee Schneemann exhibition yesterday, and you know, it's fascinating to sort of see what someone who is so kind of so pioneering as a sort of feminist artist, to see what she was doing. You know, she was a bit before Gee's time, but she was also producing work at the same time, and obviously there's crossovers as well, because, you know, Anthony McCall was did one of his installations just near our house, and Gee and Penny helped him to find the location, and you know, he was Carolee Schneeman's partner at the time, and basically just kind of thinking about, you know, they were all sort of influenced by Fluxus, for example, and Exit. Gee was and Penny were part of Exit at that time, and just kind of thinking about how all those sort of movements crossed over, I think, in the early 70s, you know. So you kind of had some, in this country, the beginnings of feminist art. I mean, I guess it would have, feminism had already sort of taken hold in America in the 60s, but in the UK it was really the 70s that started to gain some kind of real traction. You know, there's the counterculture, and obviously Gee and Penny are involved with the setting up Stonehenge and so on, with their friend Wally Hope, who obviously died under really tragic and suspicious circumstances. And they're sort of crossing over with sort of situationist influences, although Gee kind of says that she says she didn't know anything about situationism, but then she also says that they were familiar with all the underground press publications. So, you know, they had things like Freedom is obviously the anarchist one, but they had various other sort of things like Oz and International Times and so on. And they often had situationist ideas kind of, you know, were sort of carried in those publications. And Penny was, I imagine, pretty well versed in all the situationist kind of philosophy and so on. So, I mean, there's all these kind of overlaps really, and sort of anarchist ideas. And I know that Penny and Gee have said that they weren't familiar with anarchist theory at the time. It was more through crafts that they started to sort of read up on that and familiarise themselves with those sorts of ideas. But I think in the book I sort of touch upon the ideas of Murray Bookchin, the American anarchist, who, you know, his ideas around social ecology and so on, and how kind of relatable that is to a lot of the things that that were happening at Dahl House, I guess. And I know you've talked about the garden at Dahl House and how fundamental that is as well. So yeah, I think all those kind of ideas are connected to sort of living authentically, trying to live a sort of authentic life, and about the power of the imagination, perspective of what's possible, and so on. So I think that all kind of comes into it.
My guess is that the influence of Gee is probably more, as we're saying, ideas being in the air or in circulation through various publications, less so than, you know, sitting down and saying, I'm going to study Kierkegaard right now. More things just float around with what people are talking about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And in a similar way, you know, my take on it has always been that, like, Gee's sense of politics and ethics is less a series of ideas and more is about how to concretely live your life in terms of, you know, how to conduct yourself in everyday life, where to live, how to live collectively, how to, you know, how to tend the garden of your life in a certain way. So it's less about an idea, more about what you do. And I think in a way that was probably for many people, you know, one of the sort of biggest appeals of her work in crafts, but also crafts in general, and her work more generally, is that it doesn't seem like just something you're saying because it sounds cool. It's like actually just part of an overall approach to life. Yeah,
definitely. And it's those kind of ideas about sustainable life choices that come from the counterculture, really, and then that sort of crossing over with punk and sort of fusing with punk. And you know, in the 80s, then those kind of ideas you can sort of see with anarcho-punk and with the sort of traveller scene and so on. You know, because you have punk kind of seems like it's a reaction against hippie in the first wave punk, but then by the 80s through crass and anarcho-punk, it's kind of like a sort of meshing of those sort of two things in a way, I guess, and people making quite active life choices and politicized decisions and so on. I mean, I remember when I was younger, people used to sort of refer to Crass, people who were into punk anyway, and they'd sort of refer to Crass as peace punk, or I used to know one person who used to refer to them as intelligent punk. But I mean, I don't know if I would kind of go along with that, but certainly they were kind of offering something that I think, yeah, and with some of the members being older as well and having all that experience from the 70s, and the same with, Poison Girls as well. Some of those sort of ideas are really being brought over and influencing a younger generation than in the 80s.
Yeah, there's a definite sense there. Well, one of the things I love about punk is this sort of very DIY, anyone can do it approach, which sort of I think was very liberating for many people saying, I'm just going to have a go and try and see what I can do. There's also a sense which you have a number of those bands, and bands particularly like Run Crash Records, who you could tell were drawing on a different set of influences and were very serious about their craft, but they're being serious about musical craft, but not in a way that was like, going back to like really bad prog rock or like sort of over excessively technical, actually saying, what can we do if we experiment with how we play?
Yeah. And then obviously, that has an impact on like in post-punk, like hardcore, for example, like with the Dead Kennedys, and Jello Biafra was very inspired by what Crass were doing, and with the independent labels, and with sort of more politicized outlook and everything, so there's quite far-reaching sort of consequences, and that's only then, there's obviously subsequently there's been kind of tentacles reaching out into different sort of places, I guess, including more recent sort of street art and some of the stuff that Banksy and other artists associated with this project have been doing.
But it's interesting if you think about something like the Dead Kennedys. You have a lot of the artwork done by Winston Smith, right? Who's another sort of very well-known collagist. But sort of, like Gee or like Penny, he studied art formally, and I think he spent 7 years in Italy studying like classical painting design.
Yeah, and then came back, and I think was quite dismayed at what had happened to America while he was away, I think.
But it's interesting that we have these sort of forms of art production, visual production, that let's say most people think of as being very amateur or simply DIY. Oftentimes, some of the people who were involved in them actually have sort of extensive training and background in the craft itself.
Yes, no, absolutely. Winston Smith's a good example of that, and but Winston Smith, like Gee, and also like artists like Jamie Reed and Linda Sterling, actually, they all kind of had these sort of experimental kind of produced journals, fanzines, to kind of really they had a lot of freedom to experiment with their ideas through those, so Winston Smith had Fallout, and a lot of those designs that he kind of did in that publication, then they appear for the record releases on the covers and as inserts and so on for Dead Kennedys. And the same with Linda Sterling obviously had the fanzine with John Savage, and Gee with International Anthem. They're the importance of that, going back to the DIY thing, the importance of that kind of self-produced fanzine journal as a way of sort of really testing out these kind of ideas has been really, really important to their development, all of them, with their art.
I think there's also something particular important about the sort of different roles art schools or design colleges played at the time, right? Because at that time you're not paying tuition fees and you have stipends for people, so that enables a whole range of students, working class kids who otherwise probably couldn't have gone there, to sort of have time and space, basically mess around with ideas or trying different things, and end up producing amazing art and music in a way that, perhaps maybe I'm wrong, but if you go to art school today, I'm guessing you're immediately pressured by the costs, by the cost of where you're living, by sort of being pressured to sort of be a successful commercial artist from day one. Um,
Yeah, and I mean, art schools have adopted a business model for quite some time now. As higher education institutions have, and there's been like a big expansion in commercialized sort of bureaucracy that's sort of come with that, which is a lot of the sort of flexibility in teaching that there was has that's been really quite squeezed, I think, by these kind of pressures as well. And yeah, I mean, if you look at people's stories like Ian Jury and so on from Walthamstow, where Peter Blake was, and sort of Ken Russell and people, and you sort of look at there was a lot of intermingling as well of students and staff and ideas, and there was a lot of really, as well as social classes, and there was a lot of really interesting ideas coming out of there. And I guess also there were new forms in the 1960s and in the 70s rather, really, but started in the 60s, like music graphics, for example, which is obviously there's an influence of pop art there, and it's really crossing high and low culture, and you're having people from different backgrounds coming into the mix, and getting to sort of say things from different perspectives, if you like. So that whole sort of hierarchical art world and culture is sort of starting to shift to some extent, and obviously the underground press is part of that as well, in terms of defining, the people sort of defining their own culture, and that's very, very difficult. It's also things like changes to housing, so squatting's no longer legal. People used to support themselves, musicians and artists, on DSS money for a certain amount of time, and that's very, very difficult now, and has been for some time. So yeah, it's quite a different picture, I think. Yeah, I think it's been sort of steadily eroded since the 80s, that kind of the role of art schools in that sense. I wouldn't like to say that that's it, like it's all doom and gloom. I'm sure there's lots of positive things going on, but it's certainly been something that's been very sort of squeezed since that time.
Perhaps a way to sort of spin that around in a more positive direction, rather than talking about sort of what have we lost through the loss of the spaces, or what have we lost by no longer having things like the free festival movement or squatted art scenes. Maybe another way to put it would be to ask, what would need to happen for those kinds of possibilities, those kind of conditions, to make independent autonomous art be possible again? Yeah. And you do get some very interesting kind of work going on. I mean, Niles Norman has been doing some really interesting work around the idea of sort of free universities, and sort of students not being, there's been experiments where students haven't been graded for their work to see what they come up with if the grading sort of structures are removed. And yeah, you need to sort of keep sort of looking for the positives. And the other thing is that this sort of historicization process always kind of favors, sometimes it can be a bit distorted. So when you've got accounts of art schools by people like Fred Vermorel and so on, they're often sort of really, really sort of champion the kind of bohemianism and how liberating it all was. But when Gee went to art school in the early 60s, she says she remembers a much more sort of traditional setup, really, and also with quite traditional class structure still in place. So even though there was this social mobility, and even though things were changing, maybe not perhaps as much as some histories would have us kind of believe, I think those things are happening alongside each other, I think. Yeah, I think there is an interesting element there, and you discussed in the book, is sort of the importance that sort of Gee working in commercial design for a while, both her and Penny sort of ends up playing in her work overall. Can you just say a bit more about that?
About sorry, what was that about? Gee working in a more commercialized
Yeah, but sort of how that ends up sort of influencing her work more generally, and not just what she did for the New York Times or for Ebony, but sort of how that sort of maybe has effects beyond those pieces, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so in the early 70s, as well as being involved with counterculture, free festivals, and these sort of radical art collectives and so on, she was also working as a commercial illustrator for for children's books. And the thing with that was that she just kind of found it really boring in the end. So that was why she moved to America in part, because she was just sick of some of the sort of briefs that she was getting, which kind of is basically the traditionally that's the role of a illustrator, is to respond to a brief, to have quite a passive role in that respect. But she's kind of always wanted to produce work that is more that she's engaged with personally, politically, and everything else. So moving to America was really sort of liberating for her, and she did all the work for mainstream magazines. And I think it's quite interesting because she's kind of she's looking sometimes at, even though it's in a commercial magazine environment, she's looking at quite controversial topics. So for example, there's one of her illustrations on the height report on the research that was happening about women's sexuality at that time. She's providing social comment in some of her work, like broken family and death in the family and so on. And kind of also looking at more political subjects like Watergate and mafia and so on for the illustrations that are accompanying reviews and things. So really, she's on the whole not feeling as though she's compromising herself, and actually, her work's really coming on leaps and bounds in that environment, and also through being funded for the work that she's doing, through being properly remunerated for it. And you can see both the sort of design language, some of the sort of more satirical humor sort of comes out, is developing there. And some of the surrealist elements that come in, even though it's also pretty social realist, there's some surrealist elements there that kind of really do come into that illustration work that she does. That is more kind of extreme for Crass and International Anthem. So you can certainly do that. And it's interesting when you think about the fact that it's only really after Crass that she sort of really moves away from illustration as being the overwhelming medium that she's working in, to really working with such a wide range of mediums, from giant oil paintings of her children's series, and the installation that she did with Christian Brett, The Sound of Stones in the Glass House, and a whole range of work that's much more what we associate with artists, whereas before she's really working as an illustrator. And that's what she's doing since art school. So it must have been very liberating for her as well, after the Crash years, to be able to really extend her work in that way.
Yeah, so it sort of gives it a lot more breadth and freedom in what she can do with what she does. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Are there any sort of like big themes from your book that I have sadly not touched upon that you think that you would like to bring up?
No, not really. I mean, the only thing I guess is obviously pacifism is the really obvious thing that sort of comes up throughout her life's work. And it's quite interesting how there's a more sort of subtle means of communicating. There's the work that she does with Crass and through International Anthem is kind of very kind of evocative of the sort of anti-war agitprop that you see, particularly in reaction to the Vietnam War, on placards and posters, and obviously Peter Kennard's the obvious comparator there. But things like Sound of Stones in the Glass House that was installed at First Sight for the retrospective, and a couple of other places as well, where it's sort of commenting on the American presidents and their sort of track record in terms of war and collateral damage and so on, but using a very different form of communication there. And, you know, she's now more recently been engaged with more sort of direct messaging in her billboard campaigns about Palestine, and with some of the collaborative work that she's done with for some of Banksy's projects like Santa's Ghetto and so on. But yeah, it's kind of, I guess it's changed over the years, but that is something that is very predominant throughout her life, really. Yeah.
I see that those are definitely big themes. Through all of her work, most of it. So maybe it's just sort of let's say it's a sort of last thought, getting to a basis of conclusion. One of the things I particularly like about Crass Records, rather than just Crass, was how it functioned as a kind of semi-pedagogic role. So, for instance, rather than it being a regular record label, the idea was producing one single with the band, and thus they would learn the process of how you make an album, how you record it, how you produce it, how you distribute it. So rather than being something to function like a regular business, the idea was it was sort of almost like a teaching tool where what they knew was then spread to other people. And I think you could say something maybe similar about Gee's work, where the importance is not just sort of what the work is in itself, but how it inspires and how it's taken up by other people. So maybe as a way to sort of like thinking about objectives and ending, could we speculate about, let's say, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, ways that, you know, people might be encountering her work for the first time and be inspired to do other things with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, you know, I think that's a really important thing to flag up, actually. You know, if you just take Crass, for example, Crass Records, and look at how, you know, the bands often learnt skills from releasing their record on Crass Records and then set up their own label, you know, and Crass were often helped to support them in that. So Conflict setting up More to Hate, Flux of Pink Indians, Spider Legs, Subhumans, Blurg, and, you know, one little Indian record label that was set up by a bass player of Flux. And, you know, that's just one example, but so much sort of collaborative work and so much effort really in, like, sometimes I've read things that have sort of questioned whether Crass were kind of individualistic, but there's so much that is really sort of reaching out and very collaborative and kind of working with people, you know, and yeah, I mean, even I think when I sort of first approached Dollhouse, there's always ecology projects going on or art projects going on. So much of what Gee does is, even though she likes working on her own for long periods of time, so much of what she does is also kind of reaching out into the world, if you like. So I think there's a lot there that is about, you know, making those kind of connections and about these sort of processes being ongoing.
Which makes sense, because if you want to create autonomous art or have strategic autonomy, how do you learn the skills to do that? How do you sort of create conditions under which people can sort of operate in that fashion? You know, whether that be in terms of art, whether that be in terms of living.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, sharing skills as a way of sort of forming, you know, communities and so on as well. Yeah, I think that's all sort of really sort of inspiring as well. Yeah.
Cool. That sounds like a good note to end on. So thank you very much for coming along and having a chat, Becky. And I encourage everyone to go out and get your book from a reputable non-Amazon source.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So you can sort of get it direct from the publisher or, you know, various kind of retailers. Yeah. I'll also be selling some at the launch. Are you going to be able to make any of the launches, do you think?
I'll have to see. I'm not sure. It depends on, yeah, I'll have to see. Hopefully at least one.
Okay, that'd be good. Excellent. Okay, well, thanks very much, Stephen. Thank you.